The auctioneer's chant was a hypnotic rhythm under the hot July sun of '72, a staccato beat that separated men from their money. It rolled across the flattened grass of Miller's farmstead, over the rows of sun-faded machinery and the hopeful, anxious faces of the crowd. I stood near the back, my arms crossed over my chest, the sweat already soaking the collar of my chambray shirt. I wasn't here to buy big. I never was. I was here for a set of cultivators for my old Farmall H, something I could maybe get for $20, $30 if the bidding stayed lazy. The real show, as always, was up front. Richard Sterling, Rich as he insisted everyone call him, held court like a king surveying his lands. He wasn't bidding, not on this small-time stuff. He was just there to be seen, leaning against the fender of his brand-new pickup, a gleaming Ford F-250 that still had the dealer's paper plate in the back window. He wore a crisp, clean shirt, a new pair of boots, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Beside him, looking nervous and important all at once, was Mr. Abernathy from the Farmers' Trust and Savings Bank. His tie already loosened in the heat. They were selling Miller's life, piece by piece. A good man, Miller. Worked hard, but he'd overextended, bought a new combine he couldn't afford after one good year, and then two bad ones came back to back. The bank had called his note. Now his mistakes were laid bare for the whole county to see, picked over by his neighbors like vultures on a carcass. And a $20 bill, now 25. Will you give me 25? The auctioneer rattled, his voice a gravelly sing-song. Sold, for $25 to the man in the Pioneer seed corn hat. I watched Rich Sterling laugh at some comment from the banker, a big booming laugh that was meant to be heard. He was the future, or so everyone said. He farmed nearly 1,000 acres now, all of it leveraged. His fields were worked by the newest, biggest iron international harvester could produce. His brand new 1066, with the factory cab and air conditioning, was the talk of the coffee shop. He'd traded in a perfectly good 856 to get it. Said a man couldn't make money sitting on old junk. He usually said that loud enough for me to hear. My old junk was a 1968 John Deere 4020. I'd bought it used 4 years ago, paid cash. It was a good tractor, clean, a side console synchro range. It didn't have a cab, just the flat-top fenders and a canopy I'd rigged up myself. The diesel engine was honest. You could hear every beat of its heart, feel the power thrumming up through the steel deck plate. It started every time, and I knew every bolt and grease zerk on it like the back of my hand. My other tractor was my granddad's 1948 Farmall H, still earning its keep planting, cultivating and raking hay on my 320 acres. They were both paid for, just like the land itself. My father, God rest his soul, had burned that lesson into me with a branding iron. The bank gives you an umbrella when the sun is shining, Jed, he'd say, and demands it back the second it starts to rain. The auction moved on to the bigger items. A hush fell as they got to Miller's pride and joy, the combine that had broken him. A gleaner, barely 2 years old. Rich Sterling stepped forward, not to bid, but to look it over, running a hand along the sheet metal. He shook his head with a theatrical sigh, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Shame, he said to Abernathy. Man buys more machine than he's got land to pay for it. A fool's game. Abernathy just nodded, mopping his brow. The bidding was slow, hesitant. No one wanted to be seen profiting too much from a neighbor's ruin. It would eventually sell for 60 cents on the dollar to a big outfit from 2 counties over. I saw my cultivators come up. The auctioneer started at $10. I raised a finger. Someone else bid 15. I went to 20. He paused. 25, a voice called out. I looked over. It was one of Sterling's hired hands, a young kid who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Sterling was standing behind him, arms crossed, with that smirk on his face. He wasn't interested in the cultivators. He was just running me up. I shook my head and dropped my hand. Let him have them. I could weld up my old set one more time. It wasn't about the $5. It was the principle. Sterling was making a point that he had money to burn, even on petty games. He wanted to show everyone that my way of farming, careful, cautious, debt-free, was a thing of the past. He was the new way, big, fast, and financed to the hilt. As the crowd started to thin, I turned to leave. Sterling made a point of walking over, his fancy boots kicking up dust. "Jedediah," he said, using my full name like he knew it annoyed me. "Picking through the bones, are we? Thought you might be bidding on that old corn picker. It's about your speed." "Just watching, Rich," I said, my voice flat. "Just watching. You know," he said, lowering his voice into a confidential, condescending tone, "Abernathy could set you up. A new 966, maybe a bigger plough. You're working yourself to death on that old green junk. There's money to be made, real money. But you can't make it pulling 4 bottoms when I'm pulling 7. My 4 bottoms are paid for, Rich. How about your 7? His smile tightened. It was a flicker, a momentary crack in the confident facade, but I saw it. "It takes money to make money, Jed. You wouldn't understand. You're still farming like your daddy did in the 50s. This is the 70s. Get big or get out. You know the saying." "I know it," I said, turning my back on him and walking toward my old pickup. I also know Miller knew it. Look where it got him. I could feel his eyes on my back all the way to the truck. Driving home, the dust from the lane swirling behind me, his words echoed in my head. Get big or get out. It was the gospel of the day, preached from the pages of Farm Journal and from the loan desks at the bank. And maybe he was right. Maybe I was a fool, a dinosaur clinging to a bygone era while the world rushed forward. But as I pulled into my own lane, past the mailbox with stone painted on the side in my father's careful hand, and saw my 4020 sitting there in the shed, solid and waiting, I couldn't bring myself to believe it. That tractor represented more than just steel and diesel. It represented freedom. It meant that when I turned the key, the only man I answered to was myself. The crops in my field might belong to God and the weather, but the ground they grew in, and the machine that planted them, belonged to me. Before we go any further into this story, I have to ask you folks watching, which side of the fence were you on back in those days? Or which side would you have been on? Were you with the guys like Rich Sterling, believing that you had to take risks, borrow big and chase the boom? Or were you with the old-timers and the stubborn fools like me, who believed that the only profit that mattered was the one you could hold in your hand, free and clear? Let me know in the comments below. It was a debate that split families and decided the fate of more than one farm down my way. The spring of '73 came in wet and cold, the ground was saturated, and every farmer in the county was itching to get into the fields. Every morning, you'd see them, standing at the edge of a field, kicking at a clump of dirt, hoping it would crumble instead of stick to their boot. The new tractors with the big flotation tires and 4-wheel drive could get in a day or two earlier. And that was the kind of edge Rich Sterling loved to brag about. I waited. I knew my 4020, with its 2-wheel drive and narrower tires, would bog down to the axle if I pushed it. Patience was a tool, same as a wrench or a socket. My father taught me that, so I spent the time in the shop, giving the John Deere its spring checkup. I changed the oil and the fuel filters, cleaned the air filter, and greased every fitting until clean grease pushed the old stuff out. I checked the fluid in the rear end, making sure the hydraulic system was topped off. I ran my hands over the fuel lines, feeling for cracks or weak spots. It was a ritual. It was a conversation with the machine. Finally, the sun came out, the wind picked up, and the land began to heal. I was a week behind Sterling, but my fields were ready. I fired up the 4020. The 6-cylinder diesel coughed to life with a familiar cloud of black smoke that quickly cleared to a clean haze. The sound was pure mechanical honesty, a deep, throaty rumble that spoke of work. I backed it up to the 6-row planter, a John Deere 7000 I'd bought at another auction, and climbed down to hook up the hydraulic lines and the PTO shaft. The first day went perfectly. The tractor pulled straight, the planter dropped seed at the right depth, and the smell of freshly turned earth was the best smell in the world. I was making progress, row by row, feeling the satisfaction of a job done right. I worked until I couldn't see the marker track anymore, then drove home under a sky full of stars, my body tired but my mind at peace. The second day, disaster struck. I was on my last pass in the field furthest from the house when the tractor's engine note changed. It was subtle, a slight miss, a hesitation where there should have been smooth power. My ears, tuned to that engine for years, picked it up immediately. I pulled back on the throttle and the miss got worse, the engine sputtering. I pushed in the clutch and let it idle. It was running rough, shaking the whole tractor. I shut it down, and the silence that followed was heavy and absolute. I climbed off, my heart sinking. 1,000 possibilities ran through my head. Fuel filter clogged, a bit of water in the diesel, or something worse, something deep inside the engine. I bled the fuel lines first, cracking the nuts on the injectors one by one. Fuel squirted out, so it wasn't a clog. I checked the bowl on the fuel filter. A little bit of water maybe, but not enough to kill it. It had to be the injector pump. The Rusa master pump on those 4020s was a good unit, but they had their weaknesses. And if it failed, you were dead in the water. I didn't have a spare. A new one would cost a fortune, and a rebuilt one wasn't cheap either. I walked the 2 miles home, each step feeling heavier than the last. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the half-planted field. It looked like a broken promise. The next morning, I was on the phone with Miller's Parts, a salvage yard 2 counties away. Old man Miller, no relation to the farmer who went broke, had a voice like grinding gears. "A pump for a 4020 diesel?" he grumbled. "Yeah, I might have one. Pulled it off a tractor that burned. Can't guarantee it, you understand. Sell it to you as is." "How much?" I asked, bracing myself. $150. You pull it yourself." It was a gamble, but it was the only one I could afford. I drove my old Chevy pickup the 60 miles to the salvage yard. It was a graveyard of ambition, rows and rows of dead tractors, combines and plows rusting in the weeds. I found the burnt 4020, its paint scorched black, and its tires melted into puddles of rubber. The engine block was scarred but seemed intact. The injector pump was nestled deep in the side of the block, protected by a shield of steel. It took me 3 hours of wrestling with seized bolts and brittle fuel lines in the hot sun. My knuckles were busted and bleeding, and I was covered head to toe in a mixture of grease, soot, and sweat. But finally the pump came free in my hands. It felt heavy, solid. It felt like hope. Back in my own shop, I spent the rest of the day meticulously cleaning the salvaged pump. I laid out the parts on a clean rag, checking for any signs of heat damage. It looked okay. The next morning, I started the delicate surgery of installing it on my tractor. Timing was everything. You had to line up the marks on the pump with the marks on the engine, or you'd either get nothing or a busted engine. I took my time, my hands steady, referencing the worn, grease-stained pages of my I&T shop manual. By late afternoon, it was done. I reconnected the fuel lines, bled the system again until pure, bubble-free diesel flowed, and took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth. I climbed up onto the seat, turned the key, and pushed the starter button. The engine cranked, turned over, and then it caught. It sputtered for a second, then the miss was gone. It settled into a smooth, powerful idle, the sound sweeter than any music I had ever heard. I let it warm up for a few minutes, my hand resting on the throttle lever, feeling the steady vibration. I had done it. I had cheated the boneyard and saved my planting season. The total cost, $150, 2 days of lost time, and a lot of sweat and busted knuckles. When I finally got back to the field, I saw Rich Sterling's new 1066 on the neighboring farm, a cloud of dust billowing out from behind his massive 24-foot disc. He was already done planting and was working his ground for a second time. He saw me, and even from a quarter mile away, I could feel the judgment. The slow, stubborn fool finally getting back to work with his patched-up old machine. He probably thought I'd had to call a dealer mechanic out, spending a fortune. He would never understand the deep, quiet pride I felt in that moment. A pride that came not from a checkbook, but from my own 2 hands. The mid-70s rolled in on a wave of prosperity, the likes of which nobody had ever seen. Russian grain deals, soaring exports, and rampant inflation sent commodity prices through the roof. A bushel of corn, which had been worth a little over $1 when the decade started, was suddenly fetching $3, sometimes more. For farmers with grain to sell, it was like hitting the lottery. The banks, smelling money, threw their windows open. They weren't just giving out loans, they were pushing them. "Use our money, not yours," Mr. Abernathy would say, his new mantra. Land values doubled, then tripled. A man's net worth could increase by $100,000 in a single year. On paper, at least. The phrase on everyone's lips was fence-a-row to fence-a-row. Old pastures were ploughed under, conservation terraces were bulldozed flat, and every square inch of soil was put into production to chase the golden prices. Rich Sterling became the poster child for the new era. He used his rapidly inflating land values as collateral to borrow staggering amounts of money. He bought the 400 acres bordering my farm to the north, paying a price per acre that made old-timers gasp. He didn't stop there. He bought another half-section on the other side of the county. His operation swelled to over 2,000 acres. His machinery grew to match. The 1066 was traded for a new 1466, its turbocharger screaming as it pulled an even bigger plow. Then came the ultimate status symbol, the machine that silenced the coffee shop talk whenever it rumbled down the road. It was a Steiger Panther II, a giant articulated four-wheel drive tractor that looked more like a military vehicle than a piece of farm equipment. It was painted the signature Steiger green, had 8 massive tires, and a Detroit diesel engine that sounded like the world was coming to an end. He'd drive it past my place, the ground shaking, and give me a little wave from his air-conditioned cab. It was a wave that said, "Look at this. This is what you could have. This is what you're missing." And I confess, there were moments of doubt. I was making good money, the best money of my life. The corn I sold from my 320 acres brought in a staggering income. But my philosophy hadn't changed. While Sterling was buying land and iron, I was killing my debt. I took the profits and made the final payment on the farm mortgage. On a Tuesday afternoon in 1976, I walked into the Farmers' Trust and Savings, handed a check to Mr. Abernathy, and walked out a free man. The farm my grandfather had homesteaded was finally, completely ours. There was no celebration, no parade, just a quiet satisfaction that settled deep in my bones. I used the extra money to put a new roof on the house and siding on the barn. I bought my wife a new Chevrolet sedan. I even upgraded in the field, but in my own way. I found a low-hour John Deere 4430 with a sound guard body, the one with the rounded cab. It was a few years old, but the previous owner had been meticulous. It was quiet, comfortable, and a step up from the open station 4020, but I paid cash for it. The 4020 I kept, moving it to lighter duties. My net worth wasn't exploding on paper like Sterling's, but my cash in the bank was growing and my sleep was sound. The community, however, saw it differently. I was no longer just a bit old-fashioned. I was a failure. A man who lacked vision. At the co-op, I'd hear the whispers. "Jed Stone? Oh, he's doing all right, I guess. But he's small-time, never took a chance in his life." They saw Sterling's massive, pristine equipment lined up in his new machine shed the size of a gymnasium. They saw his thousands of acres of flat, black dirt. They saw success. They looked at me, with my modest farm and my mix of old and used equipment, and they saw a man who had been left behind by progress. One evening, Sterling stopped his pickup at the end of my lane as I was working on a fence. "Jed," he called out, "I just closed on the old Henderson place. That connects everything up for me on the west side." "Good for you, Rich," I said, stretching a new strand of barbed wire. "You know," he said, leaning out the window, "that little 80 of yours on the corner, the one that juts into my section, it kind of messes up my long rows. I'd be willing to make you a hell of an offer on it. A price you couldn't have dreamed of 5 years ago." "It's not for sale, Rich." He laughed. "Everything's for sale, Jed, for the right price. You could take the money, buy a nice place in town, retire. Why kill yourself out here on a place this small?" "I'm not killing myself," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I'm living. And this farm isn't just dirt to me. It's home. It's not for sale." He shook his head, that familiar look of pity on his face. "You're a stubborn man, Jedediah Stone. You're sitting on a lottery ticket and refusing to cash it in. This boom is going to last forever. A man's a fool not to ride it as high as he can." He drove off, leaving me in his dust. The boom will last forever. The words hung in the air, but I was a student of history, and my father had taught me about the boom of the Great War and the bust that followed in the 20s. I knew that trees don't grow to the sky and that every fat year is followed by a lean one. As the 70s started to wane, I began to see the signs. The price of diesel fuel crept up, then jumped. The cost of fertilizer went with it. On the nightly news, Tom Brokaw was talking about something called the prime interest rate, and how the Federal Reserve was raising it to fight inflation. It was just a whisper at first, a distant rumble of thunder on a hot summer day. But I had a feeling, a cold knot in the pit of my stomach, that a storm was coming. A storm that would wash away the paper fortunes and show what was truly built on solid ground. And Rich Sterling, for all his confidence, was farming on a mountain of sand. The first sign of the coming storm wasn't thunder, but silence. The summer of 1980 arrived hot and breathless, and then it simply stayed that way. The sky baked to a pale, hazy blue, and the rain just stopped. Day after day, the sun beat down on the cornfields, a relentless hammer on a dusty anvil. The leaves on my corn began to curl inward during the heat of the day, a thirsty prayer for a rain that never came. At night, they would uncurl, but a little less each time. I watched my yields shrink with every cloudless sunset. My costs, however, were fixed. I had fuel in the tanks and seed in the ground. Because I had no loans, the drought was a punch to the gut, a loss of a year's profit. But for Rich Sterling, it was the beginning of a hemorrhage. His operating loan for that year was immense, covering the diesel to run that big Steiger, the tons of anhydrous ammonia, the expensive herbicides. He had bet the farm, literally, on a bumper crop and high prices. He was getting neither. One afternoon in late July, I was driving past his main farmstead when I saw the Steiger parked awkwardly near the machine shed, a dealer's service truck beside it. Two mechanics in greasy coveralls were standing by the massive articulated joint, shaking their heads. I saw Rich pacing back and forth, his arms gesturing wildly. I didn't have to hear the words to know the conversation. A breakdown on a machine that complex wasn't like changing an injector pump in your own shop. It meant specialized tools, parts that had to be ordered from Fargo, and a labor bill that would make a banker weep. A week later, I saw one of the mechanics at the co-op, and I couldn't help but ask. "Transmission," the man said, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a greasy hand. "Planetary gears are shot, parts alone are over $10,000, and we can't even get 'em for another 2 weeks. $10,000. It was more than I'd paid for my 4430. I saw Rich a few days after that, filling up a 5-gallon can of gasoline at the pump. He looked haggard. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a frantic, hunted energy. His face was thinner, his eyes shadowed with worry. "Jed," he said, forcing a smile that didn't hold. "Hot one." "Sure is," I said. "Heard you were having some trouble with the big tractor." His face tightened. "Just a little thing. Dealers taking care of it. You know how it is with new equipment, always a few bugs to work out." He was lying, and we both knew it. "At least the price of corn is holding strong," he added, a note of desperation in his voice. That was the other shoe, waiting to drop. On the nightly news, they were talking about a grain embargo against the Soviet Union, a political move made by men in Washington who had never set foot in a cornfield. To them, it was a tool of foreign policy. To us, it was a death sentence. The export market, the very thing that had fueled the boom, vanished overnight. The price of corn at the local elevator didn't just drop, it fell off a cliff. From over $3 a bushel down to $2.50, then $2. The first cracks in Sterling's empire were showing, not as a single dramatic collapse, but as 1,000 tiny fissures. The broken-down Steiger sat idle through the rest of the summer, a monument to expensive failure. He had to hire a neighbor with a smaller tractor to get his fall tillage done, a quiet humiliation that spread through the county like wildfire. His payments to the fertilizer company were late. The fuel co-op put him on a cash-only basis. The whispers in the coffee shop changed from envy to a kind of morbid curiosity. Everyone was watching, wondering how long a man could tread water with an anchor chained to his leg. I felt no joy in it, only a profound and chilling sadness. The storm I had sensed was no longer on the horizon. It was here. The new decade began with a funeral dirge played by ticking numbers on a banker's desk. The Federal Reserve, in a desperate war against inflation, cranked the prime interest rate up to levels that were simply unbelievable. 10%. 15%. At its peak, it brushed 21%. For a man like me with no debt, it was an abstract number on the television screen. For Rich Sterling and thousands like him who had financed their expansion on variable rate loans, It was a guillotine. His interest payments, which were already staggering, now became impossible. Every dollar he owed the bank was suddenly costing him twice as much. Mr. Abernathy, the banker who had once clapped Rich on the back and encouraged him to borrow more, now never seemed to be in his office when Rich came calling. The friendly smiles were replaced by certified letters. The collapse came with the brutal finality of a winter blizzard. It started with the machinery. One morning, a flatbed truck from the international dealer pulled into Sterling's lane, and with grim efficiency, winched up his 1466 tractor and the massive disc that went with it. They were simply taking back what he could no longer pay for. The next week, the bank put a lien on his stored grain. He couldn't sell a single bushel without their permission, and every cent went straight to them, a drop of water on a raging fire. My life, by contrast, became smaller and more focused. I survived because my needs were few. My fuel bill for the 4430 was a fraction of what the Steiger consumed. When a hydraulic line on my planter blew during spring planting, I drove to town, bought a new hose and fittings for $20, and had it fixed myself in under an hour. I saw a neighbor spend 3 days waiting for a dealer mechanic to fix an electronic sensor on his new planter, losing precious planting time with every passing hour. My old skills, the ones Sterling had mocked, were now my salvation. I kept my own books at the kitchen table with a pencil and a ledger, so I knew my cost of production down to the penny. I knew that even with corn at $2 a bushel, I could still break even. Sterling, with his massive debt service and high input costs, was losing hundreds of dollars on every acre he farmed. The community was gripped by fear. Foreclosure auction notices began to appear in the legal section of the county paper like obituaries. Good families, who had farmed the same ground for generations, were being wiped out. The get big or get out mantra of the 70s had become a prophecy, but not in the way anyone had intended. The end for Rich Sterling came on a raw, windswept day in March of 1982. The foreclosure notice was posted on the courthouse door. The Farmers' Trust and Savings, itself teetering on the edge of insolvency from all the bad agricultural loans, was calling in everything. The date was set for an auction. All of it would be sold, the land, the equipment, the house, a lifetime of ambition, on the courthouse steps. I saw him one last time before the sale. I was at the parts store picking up a set of plowshares, and he was there, trying to buy a battery for his wife's car. His credit card was declined. He fumbled in his pockets, pulling out a crumpled wad of bills, counting them out on the counter. He was $5 short. The shame on his face was a physical thing, a heavy cloak of defeat. Without a word, I laid a $5 bill on the counter beside his money. He looked at me, his eyes hollow. The arrogance was gone, burned away by months of sleepless nights and relentless pressure. All that was left was a broken man. "I can't," he whispered. "It's not a loan," I said quietly. "Just pay it forward someday." He nodded, unable to speak, took the battery, and walked out without looking back. I knew then that the war between us, the silent battle of philosophies, was over. And in the end, there were no winners. The day of the Sterling auction was grey and cold, with a wind that cut to the bone. It felt appropriate. The crowd that gathered on the courthouse lawn was not the same eager, gossiping crowd from Miller's sale a decade earlier. These were the survivors, their faces grim, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and fear. They were there to watch a neighbor's world be dismantled, all of them thinking the same thing. There, but for the grace of God, go I. Mr. Abernathy, looking 10 years older and his suit hanging loosely on his frame, stood beside the auctioneer. He wouldn't meet anyone's gaze. The bank was just trying to salvage what it could from the wreckage. Rich was there, standing off to the side with his wife, both of them looking like ghosts at their own funeral. They started with the parcels of land he had bought during the boom years. The bidding was terrifyingly slow. Land that had been valued at $3,000 an acre just a few years before was now struggling to fetch $800. Outside investors, smelling blood, bought up most of it for pennies on the dollar. Then came the machinery. The centerpiece, parked right in front of the steps, was the Steiger Panther II. It had been repaired, but it hadn't run in over a year. It sat there, huge and impotent, its signature green paint faded and peeling, its tires weather-cracked. It was the symbol of the entire era, A massive, powerful, debt-fueled machine that had ultimately broken its owner. The auctioneer started the bidding at $50,000, a fraction of its original price. Silence. 40,000? Will you give me 40? The crowd was a statue garden. No one moved, no one could afford to buy it, and even if they could, no one could afford to run it. 30,000 then. Folks, this is a Steiger tractor. More silence. Abernathy was sweating despite the cold. This machine represented a huge chunk of the bank's bad loan. The auctioneer, desperate, dropped the price again and again. 20,000, 15. $10,000, he pleaded. Someone give me 10,000 for it. A thought, cold and clear, formed in my mind. It wasn't about pride or victory. It was about closing a chapter. It was about putting an end to the symbol of the madness. I raised a finger. I have 5,000, the auctioneer said, his voice filled with relief and disbelief. $5,000. Will anyone give 6? He looked around the crowd. No one stirred. They were all looking at me, their expressions unreadable. 5,000 going once, going twice, sold. For $5,000 to Jedediah Stone. A quiet gasp went through the crowd. I had just bought the biggest, most powerful tractor in the county, the machine that had represented everything I stood against, for less than the price of a used pickup truck. I didn't own it. The bank did. I walked over to Abernathy and wrote a check from my savings account. It didn't even make a dent. The last piece of property to be sold was the original Sterling home place, the 160 acres his father had farmed. This was different. This was his home. His wife was openly weeping now. The bidding started. An out-of-state investment group made a bid. I made a counteroffer. They raised it. I raised it again. We went back and forth, the numbers climbing slowly. I wasn't thinking about the price per acre. I was thinking about that $5 bill on the parts store counter. I was thinking about a man's dignity. Finally, the investor shook his head and stepped back. Sold, the auctioneer said, his voice flat, to Jedediah Stone. I didn't move for a long moment. The wind whipped around the corner of the courthouse, and the crowd began to disperse, talking in hushed tones. I had just doubled the size of my farm in a single afternoon, all of it paid for with cash. There was no triumph in it. I walked over to where Rich was standing, his shoulders slumped. "Rich," I said. He looked at me, his eyes empty of everything but pain. "You came to pick the bones clean after all, Jed. I guess you were right all along." "No," I said, my voice firm. "I came to stop the bleeding. The home place, I want you to rent it from me. You and your family, you stay. You farm it. We'll work out a fair price on shares. You're a good farmer, Rich. You just got caught in the storm." He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. For the first time I saw something flicker in his eyes. Not hope, not yet, but something other than despair. He simply nodded, a single sharp dip of his chin, and turned to comfort his wife. In the years that followed, the land began to heal, and so did the people. The farm economy slowly, painfully, found its footing again. The ones who survived, like me, were the ones who owed no one. The community's perspective shifted. My stubbornness was now called wisdom. My old junk was now seen as reliable. Neighbors who had once pitied me now came to me for advice, for help fixing a clutch or timing an engine. I towed the Steiger home. It sat in my shed for a winter while I tinkered with it. I got the big Detroit diesel running, its roar shaking the rafters. I found the problem with the transmission was a single cheap bearing that had failed, taking the expensive gears with it. I put $10,000 into it, twice what I paid for it, and rebuilt it from the ground up. The next spring, I sold it to a large outfit down in the river bottoms, a corporate farm that could afford to feed it. I made a handsome profit, but that was never the point. Rich became my tenant, and in time, a friend. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. We worked together, side by side, during harvest. He never again farmed with borrowed money. He farmed with what he had, and he found a measure of peace in it. My son, David, grew up turning wrenches beside me in the shop. He learned the lessons my father had taught me, not from lectures, but from living them. He saw the repossessed tractors. He heard the stories of the families who had lost everything. One cool autumn evening, years later, David and I were in the shop, working on the old 4020. It was a semi-retired King now, but we kept it in perfect running order. He was a young man, full of the same fire and ambition I'm sure I had at his age. "Dad," he said, wiping grease from his hands, "I was looking at the new tractors online, the GPS steering, the efficiency monitors. It's amazing what they can do." I nodded, tightening a bolt on the alternator bracket. "It is. Don't you ever wish you'd gone for it back then? Leased a new one, bought up more land when it was cheap after the bust?" I stopped working and looked at him, then gestured around the shop, at the tools hanging neatly on the walls, at the tractors that were ours and ours alone. I looked out the big open door, across the fields bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, land that had been in our family for 100 years, land that had no mortgage papers filed against it in the county courthouse. "All of that," I said, my voice quiet, "it's just steel and software. It's temporary. What matters is this." I tapped my temple with a greasy finger. "The knowledge to fix it. And this." I thumped my chest. "The discipline to not buy what you can't afford. Your granddad told me the bank gives you an umbrella when the sun is shining and demands it back the second it starts to rain." He was right. We survived the flood, son, because we owned our own raincoat. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw that he understood. The true legacy wasn't the acreage or the equipment. It was the freedom. The freedom from fear, the freedom from a banker's phone call, the freedom to stand on your own 2 feet, on your own land, and know that whatever came tomorrow, you would face it on your own terms. And that was a harvest richer than any field could ever produce.